The air in the bridal chamber was thick with the cloying sweetness of wilting lilies and the acrid smoke of a dying fire. It should have been warm with the aftermath of passion, but a chill had settled, seeping from the very stones of the old Blackwood Manor. Cora, her skin pale as moonlight against the dark spill of her hair, watched her new husband from the vast, canopied bed. Elias Blackwood stood at the window, his back to her, a silhouette of tense shoulders and discontent, the fine cut of his wedding coat doing little to disguise the coarseness of the man within. "A shilling for your thoughts, husband," she said, her voice a low murmur designed to carry across the space. He turned, his face a handsome mask soured by too much brandy and a native cynicism. "I was thinking of my brother," he replied, the words slurring slightly. "Saint Silas. Did you see him at the feast? He barely touched his wine, too busy judging the rest of us from his pew of righteousness." Cora smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips. He seemed focused, unmoved by the festivities. Unmoved. Elias barked a laugh, the sound hollow in the large room. "The man is carved from ice and scripture. I doubt he has a pulse, let than the capacity for sin." He stalked toward the bed, his eyes gleaming with a cruel idea. "I have a wager for you, my dear wife. A test of your celebrated charms." She raised an eyebrow, her heart beating a steady, anticipatory rhythm. "I am listening. They say you could tempt a saint from his prayers. I say you cannot break my brother. Seduce him. Make the holy sinner stumble, just once. Prove to me your power is absolute." The vulgarity of it, the sheer, delicious wickedness, thrilled her. This was a game far richer than mere matrimony. This was a duel for a man's soul, with another as the weapon. "And what are the stakes?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "Your future," Elias whispered, leaning close, his breath a fog of alcohol. "You win, and this house, its fortunes, my very name, they become yours to command. I will be your devoted servant. You lose." He let the implication hang in the cold air. Cora let her eyes drift to the heavy brass candlestick on the mantel, a wedding gift gleaming in the erratic firelight. She then looked back at her husband, her decision made. "Then it is a wager, Elias," she said, her voice as smooth and cold as the river outside. "And I never lose." She did not know then that before the night was through, that same candlestick would not merely hold a flame, but would be lifted high, its weight destined to fall, not in a symbolic transfer of power, but in a single, shattering blow that would end a life and stain the Blackwood legacy with a darkness far deeper than any sin of seduction. The game had begun, and its only guaranteed outcome was a tombstone. The celebration had been a lavish, gaudy affair, a performance for the county, but the wedding night itself was a stage of a much more intimate and brutal nature. The grand bedchamber of Blackwood Manor, still smelling faintly of new linens and beeswax, was now thick with the scent of dying firewood and the sharp, sweet residue of fine brandy. Elias had consumed a great deal of it, not with the joviality of a groom, but with a steady, determined purpose that had left his eyes glittering with a dangerous, unsated energy. Cora, already in her nightdress, watched him from the edge of the vast bed, her composure a stark contrast to his simmering agitation. The silence between them was not one of shy anticipation, but a heavy, waiting thing, broken only by the spit of the log in the fireplace. He was pacing, a caged animal in his own home, his thoughts clearly circling a subject far removed from his new bride. It was his brother's name that finally broke the quiet, spoken not with familial warmth, but with a venom that made the air grow colder. "Silas," he'd sneered, coming to a halt by the mantelpiece, his fingers tracing the ornate carving. "Did you see him? Sitting there in his somber black, judging every laugh, every toast, as if we were all reveling on the doorstep of hell itself." He turned to her, his handsome face twisted by a bitterness that seemed to predate the wedding, predate her, even. "He thinks himself so far above the base desires of common men. So pure, so untouchable. Her own design. To refuse would be to show weakness, to confirm herself as merely a decorative possession. To accept, however, was to seize an unprecedented opportunity. This was not about the sordid act of seduction itself, it was about power in its purest form. By agreeing, she would transform herself from a bride into a sovereign, her authority over Elias and his estate cemented not by law or affection, but by a victory so complete it would forever break his will. She would own him, not as a wife owns a husband, but as a champion owns a vanquished foe. The sheer, Gothic scale of the manipulation thrilled a part of her she kept locked away, the part that understood that true control is often won in shadows and through proxies. Silas, the pious brother, was merely the anvil upon which she would hammer her husband's spirit into a shape of her choosing. Her acceptance, when it came, was delivered not with the blush of a scandalized maiden nor the eagerness of a temptress, but with the cool, measured tone of a strategist acknowledging a superior move. "Then it is a wager, Elias," she had said, her voice a low, unwavering note in the tense silence. In those words, she bound him to the consequences. She was not merely accepting his foolish game, she was elevating it, sanctifying it as the true foundation of their marriage. The marriage bed, in that moment, was no longer a place of union but a war room, and she had just accepted command of the forces that would decide its future. The prize was everything, and Cora, who had climbed from far meaner circumstances to the threshold of Blackwood Manor, had no intention of losing. The game was now in motion, and she was its master. The opportunity presented itself not in the shadows of a clandestine meeting, but in the full, unforgiving light of the Manor's dining room during a somber family supper. Silas, true to his nature, had arrived precisely on time, his presence a quiet rebuke to the lingering frivolity of the wedding. Cora, seated opposite him, played her part with the precision of a watchmaker. She was the picture of a demure bride, her questions for Silas not about faith or doctrine, which she rightly guessed would put him on a familiar and fortified ground, but about the mundane mechanics of the estate he helped manage, the yield of the Southfields, the temperament of the new stallion, the repairs needed to the tenant cottages. It was a disarming tactic, appealing not to the saint but to the steward, and she watched with keen interest as his initial reserve, the wall of pious detachment, showed the first hairline fractures of surprise. He answered in measured, practical terms, his voice deeper and less severe than his brother's, his eyes the same Blackwood blue as Elias's, but washed in a different, more contemplative light, flickering to hers with a dawning curiosity. She then shifted, ever so slightly, introducing a note of gentle melancholy into her tone, speaking of the weight of her new responsibilities and a feigned anxiety about finding her place within the stern history of the Blackwood walls. This was the hook, an appeal to his innate role as a protector and a counselor. She saw his gaze soften, not with desire, but with a pastoral concern that was, for a man of his isolation, a potent gateway to a deeper connection. Throughout this delicate operation, she was acutely aware of Elias simmering at the head of the table, his jaw tight, his attempts to steer the conversation toward coarse jokes or business falling flat against the focused intensity of the exchange he himself had instigated. Cora, without ever breaking the placid surface of her demeanor, was testing the waters, and she found them not frozen solid as her husband had claimed, but deep, still, and deceptively calm. She sensed in Silas not a man of ice, but one of immense, controlled pressure, a well of loneliness and conviction that was far more complex and potentially more volatile than Elias could ever comprehend. The game was no longer an abstract wager, it had become a tangible, thrilling hunt, and the first, faint trail of her quarry had been revealed. The brothers' resistance was not the brittle, predictable defiance of a prude, but something far more formidable and unsettling. Silas did not blush or stammer at Cora's carefully layered attentions. Instead, he observed her with the quiet, unnerving focus of a naturalist studying a novel and beautiful species of spider. He recognized the game, not in its specifics, but in its essence. The calculated glance held a moment too long, the artful sigh implying a world of unspoken feeling, the seemingly innocent brush of her sleeve against his arm in the hallway. Where Elias saw only a challenge to his brother's virtue, Silas perceived a profound and dangerous inquiry into the very architecture of his soul. His faith was not a simple set of rules to be broken, but a fortress he had built stone by stone against the temptations and disappointments of the world, a fortress that had, until now, felt impregnable. Yet, Cora's presence became a subtle, insistent draft finding its way through cracks he never knew existed. He found himself watching for her, listening for the soft rustle of her skirts, a development that filled him not with anticipation, but with a cold, devotional terror. He redoubled his prayers, kneeling on the hard floor of his chamber until his knees ached, seeking to scour her image from his mind. But the prayers themselves became corrupted, his pleas for strength turning into vivid, unwelcome recollections of the faint scent of her perfume, of the way a stray curl had escaped its pin to rest against the pale skin of her neck. This internal war created a new and dangerous tension within him. His responses to her became more terse, his manner more rigid, not out of dismissal, but from a desperate need to reinforce the crumbling battlements. He began to avoid the main house, retreating to the stables or the wooded edges of the property, yet this self-imposed exile only served to make her absence a palpable thing, a spectre that haunted the quiet of the fields and the solitude of his walks. The struggle was no longer about resisting a mere woman, it was a battle for the core of his identity, and the very ferocity of his resistance was the clearest proof of the threat she posed. He was a man desperately building a dam against a rising tide, and the strain of holding back the flood was beginning to tell in the weary set of his shoulders and the hunted look that now flickered in his eyes when he was forced to be in the same room with her. Cora, with the cold pragmatism of a field marshal whose initial assault has been repelled, did not despair at the newfound fortifications in Silas's demeanor. She simply altered her strategy, recognizing that the direct approach was only hardening his resolve. If the language of the flesh had failed to translate, she would learn the lexicon of the spirit. She began a quiet campaign of feigned piety, a performance so subtle and nuanced it was her most masterful deception yet. She was seen, by design, walking towards the small family chapel at odd hours, a prayer book borrowed from the library clutched in her hands. She made a point of asking Elias, within Silas's earshot, about the history of the stained-glass saint in the east window, her tone one of reverent curiosity. Then, she engineered the crucial encounter, finding him alone in the library not by the books of law or husbandry, but standing before a shelf of dense theological works. Her approach was not that of a temptress, but of a soul in quiet turmoil. She spoke of the weight of her new position, not as mistress of a great house, but as a newcomer to a family with a seemingly long and complicated spiritual history. She confessed, in a voice softened by a tremor of genuine-sounding vulnerability, to a feeling of being adrift, of seeking an anchor in a world that felt both grand and terribly empty. She asked him, not as a brother-in-law but as a man of God, if he might recommend a text, a simple one, that could offer guidance to a seeking heart. It was a masterstroke, an appeal not to the man, but to the very core of his identity as a counselor and a guardian of faith. It placed him in a position of authority and compassion, a role he was conditioned to fulfill, effectively dismantling his defenses by inviting him to step deeper into her life under the sanctified banner of spiritual guidance. She presented herself not as a threat to his salvation, but as a potential testament to it, a soul he could shepherd, thereby weaving the very noose meant to bind him from the threads of his own deepest convictions. The culmination of her strategy was a scene of deliberate, Gothic staging. The old summer house, a folly of crumbling white stone at the far end of the neglected garden, was her chosen venue. It was a place shrouded in the skeletal fingers of untended ivy, a relic of a more frivolous Blackwood past, now given over to melancholy and shadow. She sent a note, not through a servant whose gossip might fuel the estate's whispers, but by leaving it tucked between the pages of the devotional text he had lent her, a book she knew he would ask for in the morning. The message was a masterpiece of feigned distress, scrawled in a hand that suggested a struggle for composure. It spoke of a spiritual crisis born of the night's silence, a terrifying void she could not face alone, and a desperate need for his guidance, for the strength of his conviction to steady her own. She named the summer house for its seclusion, a place where her shameful uncertainty would not be overheard by the judging walls of the main house. The moon, a sliver of cold bone in a star-pricked sky, provided the only light as she waited, the chill of the damp stone seeping through her shawl. She did not pace, but stood perfectly still in the center of the rotunda, a figure of exquisite torment carved from the shadows themselves. Every detail was calibrated, from the slight, vulnerable tremor she forced into her hands to the way she allowed a single tear to trace a path down her cheek, catching the meager light just as she heard the crunch of his cautious footsteps on the gravel path. She had not lured him with the promise of forbidden pleasure, but with the irresistible bait of a soul in peril, a call to duty that his entire identity was constructed to answer. He entered the space not as a man stepping into a trap, but as a priest entering a confessional, his face a mask of solemn concern, his own personal war between suspicion and obligation raging behind his eyes. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the quiet darkness of the garden held its breath. The air in the summer house was a physical presence, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the cloying sweetness of night-blooming flowers that clung to Cora like a phantom perfume. She stood before him, not as a seductress now, but as a portrait of profound spiritual unraveling, her voice a fragile thread of sound as she confessed to a crisis of faith she had meticulously invented. She spoke of the terrifying silence of God, of the emptiness she found in her new, grand life, weaving a tapestry of such convincing despair that it began to feel almost real in the telling. Silas, who had entered braced for a different kind of assault, found his defenses disarmed by this unexpected siege upon his compassion. He listened, his initial rigid posture softening as he offered words of scripture, his voice low and steady, a rock in the turbulent sea of her feigned anguish. But as she stepped closer, her eyes glittering with manufactured tears, appealing not to the man but to the savior she pretended he was, the carefully maintained boundary between pastoral duty and human connection began to blur. The moonlight caught the pale, elegant line of her throat as she bowed her head, and the scent of her hair, so close now, was an intoxicating mix of night air and lavender. His words faltered. The scriptural responses felt suddenly hollow, intellectual constructs that had no power in the face of such raw, human need. He saw not a temptress, but a soul shivering on the precipice, and the urge to comfort, to anchor her, became a physical ache in his chest, a terrible, human impulse that momentarily drowned out the bells of heaven. His hand, which had been clenched at his side, uncurled. In a single, unthinking motion that was less about desire and more about a profound, catastrophic failure of his own spiritual insulation, he reached for her. His fingers did not grasp with passion, but with a desperate, trembling need to connect, to offer a solace that words had failed to provide. His hand found not her flesh, but the thin fabric of her shawl, his touch landing on her arm with the weight of a falling world. It was not a caress, but a collapse. The contact lasted only a second, a spark jumping a gap, but in the charged silence of that ruined folly, it was as loud as a pistol shot. It was the moment the fortress wall crumbled, not from a battering ram, but from a single, fatal crack of genuine, misplaced compassion. The brandy that had fueled the wager now fueled a far darker fire in Elias's blood. The longer Cora's absence stretched, the more the grand bedchamber felt like a prison, each tick of the clock a hammer blow to his pride. The image of her, the triumphant gleam in her eye as she had accepted his vile challenge, now curdled in his mind, transforming into a vision of her in the arms of his sanctimonious brother. The wager, his own foolish weapon, had turned in his hand and was now gutting him. He could not sit still. The house was a tomb, silent and accusing. Driven by a jealousy so violent it was a physical taste of copper in his mouth, he stalked from the room, moving through the darkened hallways like a phantom, his footsteps silenced by the thick carpets. He did not know where to look, but some primal instinct, some deep-seated knowledge of his brother's habits and the secluded places of the estate, drew him toward the gardens. The moon provided just enough ghastly light to see by, and the crunch of gravel under his own feet seemed deafening in the stillness. Then he saw them, through the broken latticework of the summer house, a tableau more damning than any confession. They were standing close, too close, silhouetted against the faint interior gloom. Cora's head was bowed, a picture of vulnerability, and Silas was reaching for her. His brother's hand, the one that was always clasped in prayer or pointing to scripture, was outstretched, making contact. From Elias's vantage point, shrouded in the jealous dark, the context of spiritual comfort was entirely lost, stripped away by the ravenous, green-eyed monster consuming him. All he saw was the culmination of the bet, his wife's victory, his own catastrophic loss. It was not an embrace, but it was a connection, an intimacy that shattered the last vestiges of his reason. The silent garden seemed to roar in his ears. The wager was no longer a game, it was a prophecy of his own humiliation, and in that fractured second, watching his brother's hand upon his wife, Elias felt the foundation of his entire world crack and splinter, giving way to a blind, possessive rage. The silence of the garden was not broken by a shout, but by the violent crunch of gravel as Elias erupted from the shadows, his former stark, furious shape bursting into the fragile world of the summer house. The scene, already frozen in the tense aftermath of Silas's touch, shattered into 1,000 sharp-edged pieces. "Get your hands off my wife." The words were a guttural roar, ripped from a place of raw, unthinking possession. Silas recoiled as if scalded, his hand snapping back to his side, his face a canvas of shock and instant, gut-wrenching guilt. But the guilt was not for the sin Elias imagined, it was for the catastrophic failure of his own resolve, for allowing himself to be maneuvered into this exact, damning position. He tried to explain, his voice strained, reaching for the language of pastoral care and spiritual crisis, but the explanations were like paper shields against the cannonade of his brother's fury. Elias would hear none of it. He was a man unmade, every bitter resentment toward his brother's piety, every insecure fear about his new wife's loyalties, now finding its violent, coherent voice. He threw the wager in Cora's face, not as a secret pact, but as an accusation of her inherent treachery. "Is this your prize, then? Is this how you secure your dominion?" he snarled, the words twisting the entire situation into a confirmation of his deepest paranoia. The confrontation was no longer a love triangle, but a brutal clash of two opposing worldviews: Elias's, rooted in base possession and wounded pride, and Silas's, now crumbling under the weight of a transgression that looked exactly like the sin he was accused of. Accusations of betrayal were met with desperate pleas for reason, cries of damnation with protests of innocence, the two brothers circling each other in the tight, moonlit space, their shared history curdling into something pure and poisonous. Cora, for her part, did not speak. She watched, her earlier performance of vulnerability replaced by a still, calculating observation. She had lit the fuse, and now the two Blackwood men were consumed in the ensuing explosion, their voices rising, their gestures becoming more sharp and dangerous, the air crackling with the imminent promise of violence. The wager had been the poison, and this confrontation was the feverish, final convulsion. The argument escalated with a terrifying velocity, a cyclone of shouted accusations and desperate denials that stripped both men of their reason and their civility. Elias, his face a grotesque mask of fury, advanced on Silas, his finger jabbing the air as he detailed every perceived slight, every ounce of bitterness he had ever carried for his brother's quiet virtue. Silas, cornered and morally compromised, found his own righteous anger rising to meet the assault, his voice trembling not with fear but with a fervent, defensive rage at having his intentions so violently misconstrued. The physical space of the summer house became a prison, the two brothers circling, their movements agitated and sharp. It was Elias who first crossed the line from words to action, shoving Silas hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back against a small, wrought-iron table where a single, heavy brass candlestick stood, a forgotten relic of some long-past romantic evening. The shove was the final, irrevocable step, transforming the conflict from a war of words into a physical struggle for dominance. As Silas regained his balance, his own hands coming up to defend himself, his eyes blazed with a holy fire, and he uttered not a threat, but a condemnation, a phrase that spoke of divine judgment and eternal damnation. Those words, dripping with the very piety Elias had always despised, were the spark that lit the powder keg. Blind to everything but the need to silence that voice, to obliterate the sanctimonious judgment he saw in his brother's eyes, Elias's gaze fell upon the candlestick. His hand closed around the cold, intricately carved brass. There was no thought, no calculation, only a white-hot surge of primal rage. He did not swing it like a weapon, but brought it up and then down in a single, brutal, overhand arc. The impact was not loud, but sickeningly dense, a dull, wet thud that seemed to swallow all other sound in the garden. Silas's body did not fly back dramatically, it folded, collapsing inward upon itself, his legs giving way as he sank to the stone floor, a dark, swift stain already spreading through his fair hair. The holy fire in his eyes extinguished instantly, replaced by a vacant, final stillness. The candlestick, now smeared and glistening, fell from Elias's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the stone beside the body, its resonant ring the only sound left in the profound and terrible silence.